Golden Wind's story can be divided cleanly into two parts, before and after the betrayal. There's a change in the main cast of characters as well as the villains that appear. The main story of the anime changes, and so do character motivations with it. But what about the quality of this story? The quality doesn't divide as nicely as the story itself. First of all, there's 3 parts here. The beginning third is the first 13 episodes from the introduction to the fight at Pompeii. The middle third is from episode 14 to 32, starting with the train to Florence and the lead up to the Colosseum. The final third is from episode 33 to the finale, from the Colosseum to the epilogue. But aside from the number of parts, there's also a distinct lack of consistency when it comes to the quality of these parts. I think the first third is rather mediocre. I think the second third has some of the best moments in not just the anime, but the entire series. And I think that the final third falls pretty hard on its face. Let's start with the first 13. The beginning starts strong enough. The bits with Koichi in episode 1 are pretty nice and do a decent job at showing off who Giorno is. I don't think Leaky-Eyed Luca is that interesting, but he's mostly a segue to get Bruno into the story, so it's fine. Bruno's disgusting introduction and everything that happens in the trolley is great, and I think helps set up Golden Wind to have one of the strongest openings in the series, although I think Battle Tendencies' introduction was just a tiny bit better. Popo is another great character. His position as Capo automatically makes him a very imposing character, and his visual design, voice acting, and his dwelling in the prison all help add to this a lot without wasting the anime's time. Things start to change with episode 5, where the anime introduces most of the other main characters in the restaurant scene. We get 4 characters thrown at us all at once, and there's one great thing this accomplishes. The anime doesn't bother with setting up some sort of introductory episode for each of these characters yet, and lets us observe them go about their daily routines, like Fugo teaching Narancia math or Mista throwing a fit over some cake. By watching them do these relatively mundane things, we start putting together our own images and profiles of these characters without the anime having to directly narrate it to us. There's so many moments like these over the course of the anime that makes the group feel like it consists of actual people instead of fake scripted characters. The personalities of the individual members are also pretty distinct, which only adds to that very feeling of creating our own image of them. So that's the attempt here, and I would honestly say that it succeeds for the most part. However, it does come at the cost of making the subsequent fights weaker. By tossing all the characters at us in one fell swoop, the anime has to find some other way to expand upon things like their background and abilities. This other way turned out to be cramming all of it into episodes 5 through 13 by giving each member minus Bruno their own fight that usually lasts 2 episodes and dropping in a narrated flashback somewhere in there. I don't like inserting the flashbacks into the fights because it messes with the overall flow of it. Whenever the flashbacks pop in, there's this pause and tension that I would call very inconvenient at best. On top of this, the fights here aren't particularly amazing outside of Little Feat, which I think is a decent fight. I think the main reason for this is because the villains that show up in this fight aren't all that great, especially when you compare them to Bruno and Popo. And this is a shame too, because the Hitman team actually contains a fantastic bunch of characters, they just don't show up here. As far as the flashbacks themselves go, most of them are fine. All of the ones tied to the team members follow the same general story of a decent life that gets ruined for one reason or another, and Bruno comes around to help them get back on their feet. I think there's enough variety here with each member's take on that story, but my patience wore thin having to watch these pop up basically every other episode. The Hitman team's flashback, on the other hand, is fantastic in a way that fits the anime's darker tones. It's a good way that the anime sets up for Diavolo, and more importantly, an amazing way to set up for Risotto, whose screen time ends up being criminally too low. If the flashback fights were spread out a little more, then I probably wouldn't have any real complaints about them. But as it stands, going through back-to-back-to-back-to-back fights set up like these makes it feel more like the anime is going through a checklist to make sure it covered every character before getting into the real story. Outside of spacing the fights out more, one brutally inelegant solution to fixing this could have been to remove the flashbacks entirely, then place them all in a single filler episode, maybe somewhere between the Pompeii fight and the train to Florence. I don't think it would end up being a very interesting episode since it would be a whole lot of narration, but it would save all those fights from having that awkward pause in them. Another solution could be to redesign all of the villains to bring them up to Bruno and Popo's level, but that would almost certainly require rewriting the fights from the ground up to accommodate for these changes. Express Train to Florence marks the beginning of the second third I talked about, where the anime is firing on all cylinders. First of all, most of the fights here are all pretty damn good, with some of them being candidates to be the best fights in the entire series. The most notable ones are the fights against multiple stand users, something that the series has been sorely lacking outside of the whole horse fights in Stardust Crusaders. These fights can be on a larger scale and go on for longer as well because of the wealth of options that are provided by simply adding an extra stand into the mix. This is especially the case in the Grateful Dead Beach Boy fight and the Green Day Oasis fight. One of the strongest aspects of the second third are the cast of villains that we get to see. Across the 8 fights we see, I think all of the villains are very solid, interesting characters. Yes, this even includes Carne, whose entire character is showing up to die. Prosciutto, Pesci, Malone, Ghiaccio, and especially Risotto are all great and makes the whole of the Hitman team feel like so much more than just a group of bad guys thrown into the story for the sake of needing bad guys. Dopio is another amazing addition as his generally softer personality contrasts Diavolo in a way that causes the dual personality gimmick to become something core to their characters instead of something just tacked on to make them sound interesting. The phone calls were all great in that they give Dopio a very unique trait that no other characters could come close to replicating. I do have a few complaints about Dopio, however. The main one is in episode 26 where both his backstory and the fortune teller scene are. These are both individually good scenes, but I think they both hammer home the same point that there's a secret to this Dopio guy. The easy solution would have been to simply place these in 2 different episodes instead of the same one. 2 minor complaints about Dopio are, 1, I wish his first few phone calls didn't actually show what he was calling on in order to make Dopio seem more normal, so when it's revealed that he's calling on all these random objects, our image of him drastically changes. And 2, I wish Dopio appeared earlier in the anime instead of being dropped in a little over halfway given how important he becomes in the story. This could have also given opportunities to not only move one of the scenes out of episode 26, but also to make room for a few disguised phone calls. Something that really becomes noticeable in the second third that is actually consistent through the entire anime are the choices of settings used in fights. I think Golden Wind has some of the best arenas in the entire series, and I think it has to do with picking Italy as the main setting. Italy has a lot of famous locations that even people that have never been to Italy will know, such as Pompeii, the canals of Venice, and the Colosseum. Whenever fights take place outside of these famous places, those are also set in more generic but still compelling locations such as a cathedral, yacht, truck, train, airplane, and a wrecked helicopter. It's a lot of vehicles, and while the gimmick of someone falling off, but also not really, is overused, the variety presented here is still more than enough to forgive that. Amidst all of the fighting, there are solid character moments sprinkled throughout. The beatdowns of Pesci and Cioccolata, Giorno resurrecting Bruno, Baccio's death on the beach. These all act as exclamation points at the end of a brilliant sentence in that they enhance the fights that came right before them instead of trying to occupy the same spotlight as those fights. There's still weak moments here and there in the midsection. Babyface is a fight I'm not particularly fond of. Spice Girl's introduction is great, but she basically doesn't become relevant again until the very end, which makes me wonder why she had to be revealed at this specific moment and not just at the end when Trish faces Diavolo. Polnareff's sudden entrance after Baccio's death feels like an awkward way to force the story along. It's nice to see an old character make a return, but the only reason the gang goes to Rome is because they were told to go there. The story behind the arrow is pretty cool though. There's 2 promises that the anime has made so far that the ending is responsible for delivering on. The first is the arrow promised by Polnareff and Polnareff himself to a lesser extent or a greater extent depending on how nostalgic you're feeling. The second is Diavolo and King Crimson, who has been set up to be the final boss. And to deliver upon these promises, the anime gives us 2 fights. Everyone against Silver Chariot Requiem and then the remaining survivors against Diavolo. The reason why the ending section fails for me is because each of these fights have a critical problem tied to the enemy stands. The main problem with the Chariot fight is the sun mechanic. Bruno unzipping and destroying his sun was enough to kill Chariot and undo the soul swap effect. As Diavolo explained to us very kindly, every person has their own sun when viewing Chariot, but destroying only one of these suns was enough to kill the stand entirely. Therefore, the existence of multiples of these suns becomes pointless besides allowing the scene to be a bit more dramatic when Diavolo figures it out. Either every single sun needs to be destroyed or there only needs to be one sun to begin with. The main problem with the final Diavolo fight is when Epitaph envisions Diavolo defeating Giorno, but this is all undone because Gold Experience Requiem simply exists. I don't need to go into detail for this one like I did with the Chariot fight because nullifying a stand's power for no reason is an issue that explains itself. The main problems in both the Diavolo fight and the Silver Chariot Requiem fight stem from a common source. The enemy stands were designed with no weaknesses in mind. Because there is no clear weakness present in them, some kind of answer had to be devised to allow the good guys to win. The sun mechanic feels so sudden and out of place that I have to wonder if this was supposed to be a bigger focus in the Chariot fight that never got to be fully built on. What's frustrating about King Crimson's timeskip being cancelled is that a very similar problem existed in the final Dio fight in Stardust Crusaders. The enemy stand was just far too strong, so that part's respective Jojo suddenly pulls off a move that is never properly explained. Now, these are supposed to be capstone fights in the anime, a grand finale, and because this is Jojo after all, so there's always a little more leeway for, let's call it, creativity. But both of these problems play such a massive role in their respective fights and rely on them so much that it leaves me bitter when thinking about them. Sleeping Slaves is the saving grace of the ending section because of how successful it was in making me reflect upon the entire story. It's definitely an atypical ending, especially when you compare it to some of Golden Wind's predecessors, but I think it's one that ends up working out. So that wraps up my overarching thoughts on the anime, but there's still a few more specific topics I want to touch on. While I think Diavolo is an interesting villain, especially when you take into account Dopio, I think he was just a worse version of Kira pound for pound. These are both villains that want to conceal their identities from everyone, wielding some of the strongest stands in the entire series, but I think Kira's position as a seemingly ordinary person is a much better way to execute this idea than being at the top of a criminal organization. After all, being a boss draws attention to himself, which completely counteracts his goal. I also think Kira is a character with more dimensions than Diavolo, as we saw through various parts, such as his introduction with Shigechi, his interactions with Shinobu, and his newfound confidence after acquiring Bites the Dust. Diavolo doesn't really have much in that department, with the only examples I can think of being his encounter with Bruno in the cathedral basement, and his various phone calls with Dopio, both of which solidify sides of him we've already seen instead of expanding into new territories. Gold Experience has to be one of the most broken stands I've ever seen, and it was really frustrating for me from a viewer's perspective. It boils down to Gold Experience being able to do too much with very few drawbacks, a problem that also existed in both Star Platinum and Crazy Diamond. Gold Experience can give life. When powers can be described in these generic ways, it leaves a lot of room for flexibility in what the stand can perform. In fact, it leaves too much room in this case. The supposed weaknesses of the stand, such as its short range or being unable to give life in cold environments, barely do anything in terms of actually limiting the stand itself. Therefore, it can simply manufacture a solution out of any problem because of this lack of restraint. Aside from the White Album and Green Day fights, I didn't care much for any of the fights involving Gold Experience for these reasons. Conceptually speaking, Requiem stands are something I'm surprisingly okay with, which I understand is pretty ironic of me to say given that I just came off of complaining about how much I didn't like Gold Experience for being too strong. But since these are stands that have been pierced by the arrow a second time, they should rightfully be too strong. The anime has already set an example of this before with Kira being pierced with the arrow to awaken Bites the Dust, which was, just like these Requiem stands, an extremely powerful ability. And yes, I'm aware that Kira being pierced isn't the same as a stand being pierced, but it's the same general principle. I don't want this video going on for much longer, so I'll just do a quick rundown of what I think of the fights in Golden Wind. Sticky Fingers is a fight that starts strong and tapers off, but is still a solid fight to open the anime with. Black Sabbath is a cool stand in a cool arena that unfortunately was perfectly countered by Gold Experience's ability to remove cover. Soft Machine, Kraftwerk, and Babyface are all very average fights that I honestly forgot existed until I went back to review the fights for this video. Little Feet is probably the best fight in the first third, but its competition is not that stiff. I think the fight drags on for too long as well, but that could be a result of having two flashbacks placed square in the middle of it. Man in the Mirror is the worst fight in the anime. Illuso could have saved himself a whole lot of trouble by just killing Fugo and Abakio when he had them trapped, and there's no way that Giorno could have infected himself before the virus dries out while surviving before entering the mirror world. And yeah, the whole brick snake thing too. Grateful Dead Beach Boy, Metallica, and Green Day Oasis are my votes for some of the best fights in the entire series. Grateful Dead Beach Boy is my definitive favorite, but my second favorite will be an eternal battle between the other two fights and Vanilla Ice. White Album has possibly the most intense opening to any fight in the anime, going from 0 to 60 in an instant, or 60 to 0 in this case. The fight starts to get really messy when they dive into the canals though, and I didn't care much for Giorno getting preachy about resolve. The fight in the cathedral basement is good for the most part, and the build up into the elevator is all great stuff. I think it ends kind of poorly with the Deus Ex Coco Jumbo though. I'm not a big fan of Talking Head and Clash, as the stands shown off here are less impressive compared to some of the other ones we saw before this fight. Talking Head especially feels like a stand that would have belonged in Diamond is Unbreakable. However, I do think that the fight is probably better than I think it is because the big moments of Bruno being brought back and the betrayal in the previous episode might have unfortunately doomed any fight coming right after it because it's unlikely to live up to these moments. Similar to Black Sabbath, Notorious Big is another cool stand in a cool arena, but it unfortunately had to step aside for the big Spice Girl reveal, which is a shame since I would have liked to see more of Big. I do like that they give Big a bit of an extra story after he falls into the ocean though. If you were to get rid of the sun mechanic entirely and gave it a proper weakness, I think Silver Chariot Requiem had the potential to reach the same threshold as the 3 fights I nominated earlier as some of the best in the series. Soul Swap is a really cool ability, and even though nothing is done with the metamorphing, it helps add a bit more to the tone of the fight. I'm not sure if the King Crimson fight can be saved like Chariots could without redoing the entire fight from scratch. I think there's too much of that creativity here. I don't count Rolling Stones as a fight, but putting it here just to round it all out. Like I said, it's a cool ending. I want to say that Golden Wind is better than its predecessors. After all, when looking at it from a bubble containing just the midsection, I'd say Golden Wind has the best fights, settings, and antagonists across parts 3, 4, and 5. But having watched it go through a literal up and down opening and towards an ending that collapses into itself, it's not something I could ever see myself saying comfortably. And it's an absolute shame because everything between the opening and the ending is some of the best in the series. Consistency isn't something that the series quite gets a grasp of, and I think it shows more in Golden Wind than it did in Stardust Crusaders or Diamond is Unbreakable. Maybe the series has embraced its own inconsistency, and maybe I need to do the same. I said the word shame a lot over the course of this video, and I think that word alone summarizes my feelings about Golden Wind perfectly. So, this video ended up being a lot more negative than I first imagined it would be when I sort of started writing the first draft of this video a couple months ago before I put it away to work on some other stuff like the Gridman video and whatnot. But that's fine, you know, opinions change, and I think my opinion on the anime certainly changed over time as I spent more and more time looking at it for this video. And as far as the video itself is concerned, the only thing I have to say about it is I say quality of the story at the start of the video, but I end up going on to talk a lot about the fights. So that was my bad. I probably should have picked a less generalizing word than story for the purposes of the video. So that's about it for the video. The next video I hope will not take too long to come out, although I am trying something new this time around, so I'm not sure how much that will impact the writing for the script, but hopefully it won't change it that much. So I guess we'll see. My goal is to have it out before the end of August, and yeah, somewhere around that time. So that's pretty much all from me for today. Thanks for sticking around and watching the whole video, and yeah, take care.